You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
It's a well-known fact that disease killed far more people than bullets during the war between the states. In fact, disease killed more things than gunshots, artillery, accidents, drowning, starvation, suicide, everything else combined. The worst disease during the war between the states, no doubt, was dysentery. Dysentery accounted for around 45,000 deaths in the Northern Army and about 50,000 deaths in the Confederate Army. And the reason that dysentery and so many other diseases were able to spread so rapidly between both armies was primarily because of the lack of sanitation practices and also contaminated water. The truth is that proper hygiene during the time of the war was just non-existent. And this was not because the doctors and the nurses were negligent. They just didn't know any better. During the war between the states, medicine just was not advanced enough to connect the lack of hygiene with the spread of disease. And so, for example, during a typical surgery, cleanliness was an afterthought. The surgeons would just use the same tools over and over again from patient to patient to patient. Usually they never cleaned them at all. If they did clean them, they just wiped it on their apron and then went on to the next patient. So cross-contamination was not thought of as a problem back then. And there was no thought of washing or sanitizing instruments after they'd been used or before they were used and so forth. Also, surgeons did not wash their hands between patients. They didn't wear gloves and so forth. People back then just didn't realize that there was a link between hygiene and help. Also, the nurses during the war between the states, they tended to help sick soldiers, and often they would put themselves at risk for disease by doing so. And then there was the issue of disease and contaminated water. Things like placing the latrine downstream away from the clean water source was often overlooked. And so fouled water would quickly lead to water contamination as the latrine would flow into the river or the lake, and then the soldiers would go to the river or the lake for their drinking water. There's an interesting book that provides a lot of information about disease during the time of the war between the states, and it's called Nature's Civil War: Common Soldiers and the Environment in 1862 Virginia. And it basically describes what the soldiers really had to endure just to keep themselves healthy in such an unhealthy environment. And so what I want to do on today's TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Show, is I want to talk about diseases during the war between the states. Right now we're dealing with the coronavirus and this worldwide pandemic disease. I want to talk about diseases during the war between the states. And of course, there were a number of them. The biggest of which, besides dysentery, the next biggest of which would have been typhoid. And typhoid, we talk about contaminated water. Typhoid, its main cause of spread was contaminated drinking water. It killed around 30,000 Confederates and about 35,000 Union troops. In fact, 1 out of every 3 people who contracted typhoid died of it. Another was pneumonia. Pneumonia was responsible for the deaths of about 20,000 Union soldiers and about 1,700 Confederate soldiers. 1 in 6 people who got pneumonia died from it. In fact, Stonewall Jackson did not die from the gunshot wound that he received at Chancellorsville, but rather he died several days later in a hospital of pneumonia. Pneumonia was an opportunistic disease, if you will. It looked for weak people to inject itself into. And so if you became wounded on the battlefield, as Jackson did, and you became sick with something else, pneumonia was going to find you, and your immune system was already compromised. Quite often, pneumonia would be a killer. And then there was measles. Measles killed a lot of people. In fact, about 11,000 soldiers on both sides died of measles. With so many people gathered in such small areas, measles was able to spread rapidly, and about 1 in 20 people who got measles died as a result of it. Another big killer during the war was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis killed about 14,000 soldiers. And at that time, there was no known cure for tuberculosis. Even today, there's really not a cure, but at least it can be treated. Whereas back then, you got it, there was no treatment. Today, you get it, you've got it for life, but you can manage it. Back then, there was no management of it. It took your life. Malaria was prevalent during the war. It killed some 30,000 soldiers on both sides. And you say that's a lot, but when you consider that 3 million people contracted the disease, the mortality rate really was not that high. And that was due in large part because of an available supply of quinine, which was used to successfully prevent and treat the disease. The big thing that all of these diseases had in common was that nobody had an idea of how to cure them except for malaria. And of course, hygiene and things were lacking back then. Whereas, now we're constantly washing our hands and using hand sanitizer and things that just weren't available back then. They never even thought to wash their surgical instruments. They never thought to wear a mask or to wear gloves or some of the things that we are doing today. And so the result was that disease was a horrible thing that took its toll on both the Union and the Confederate armies. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. But first, let's break for a brief commercial from our friends over at TBR Magazine.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Of all of the diseases that ravaged the war between the states period, I think the one that was the most feared was smallpox. From April 29th to May 30th, 1862, over 300,000 men converged upon the tiny railroad depot of Corinth in northern Mississippi. What these soldiers feared far more than the bullets was the smallpox. The Union soldiers scarred the landscape with miles of earthen fortification and trenches, but the pockmarks of the smallpox were the real scars that were left upon the land. Thomas Macaulay, he referred to smallpox as the most terrible of all the ministers of death, a predator that craved those close, confined spaces where men's blood, breath, and spit mingled freely. And although they fought on opposite sides of the trenches, both the Union and the Confederate forces shared a common enemy, and that was smallpox. I read one particular diary, and it was written by a gentleman by the name of Edward Willis, and he was a Union soldier who, after the capture of Corinth, he was hospitalized, and he spent the next 2 months after the battle in the hospital, and his service records showed no cause for his admission into the hospital, but many years later, his wife would say that it was because he had contracted smallpox while he was in the Army. And so it's believed that he was in the hospital at this time for that treatment for smallpox. And of all the infectious diseases, smallpox was not the most common, but it was the most feared. In fact, during the course of the war, the Union Army reported about 12,000 cases of smallpox amongst the troops, compared to nearly 68,000 cases of the measles. But the total deaths from both diseases were about the same at 4,700 and 4,200 respectively. And so the death rate from smallpox hovered at around 39%. And so it was no wonder that the medical personnel and the officers in both armies were distraught over the prospect of a smallpox epidemic hitting northern or southern cities, hitting the suburbs and so forth. And of course, ravaging the armies and rendering them incapable. And so both the northern and the southern doctors and officers, they would scour the countrysides looking for small children to create what they called a pure vaccine, one that was free from other diseases like syphilis that could be transmitted by adults. And so they would find these small children who had been infected with smallpox, get blood samples and pus samples from these children so that the doctors could administer it in small doses to the soldiers, hoping that this would vaccinate the soldiers. But they couldn't get these pure vaccines fast enough. And so the soldiers in both armies would resort to vaccinating themselves. They would take a nail or a knife or any sharp thing that they could get, and they would cut a deep wound into themselves, and they would inject the blood or the pus or the spit of somebody who had smallpox, hoping that it would get into their bloodstream and that they would develop antibodies. Now, were they risking infection? Of course they were, and they knew that they were. But they feared the smallpox far more than they feared the infection. The soldiers were self-vaccinating, and it got so bad that in May of 1863, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Inspector General for the Army of Northern Virginia estimated that there were at least 5,000 Confederate soldiers who were unfit for duty because they had given themselves these spurious vaccinations. And so, again, the disease claimed far more lives than did the bullets. The historians of medicine commonly refer to the mid-19th century or the War Between the States period as the medical Middle Ages in the United States. The Union Army, when the war began, had fewer than 100 surgeons and assistant surgeons. There was no organized ambulance service to remove soldiers from the battlefield, and soldiers who did make it off the battlefield would find their way to a squalid camp hospital, and they fared very little better there than they would have on the battlefield itself. And the Union Army had a far better medical corps than the Southern Army did. And so is it any wonder that soldiers on both sides fell victim to smallpox and other infectious diseases? Smallpox for a millennium had followed the trade routes of empire and war. And no doubt when the War Between the States broke out, it found its way into the armies, both Northern and Southern. One of the doctors, he was stationed in St. Augustine, Florida. His name was Dr. W. Brown. And he said that smallpox, when uncomplicated, requires no medication except an occasional anodyne to allay the nervous irritation and, of course, for the patient to procure rest. Unfortunately, in this era, before modern sanitation and antibiotics, not to mention all the other complications of war, the people who were stricken with smallpox were already suffering with fatigue, with malnutrition, with typhoid, with dysentery. Their immune systems were already compromised, and so their cases were never uncomplicated. And more often than not, smallpox would strike the deadly blow. Now, after the war, the United States would have a revival of medical, call it medical renaissance, if you will. Medical knowledge would increase. They would realize the need for sanitation, the need for sterilization of instruments. Ambulance corps would be established, ambulatory corps, and the Army Surgical Corps would become the best in the world. But this would be after the War Between the States. And so during the war, of course, things like smallpox would just wreak havoc. When the patient contracted smallpox, the soldier, he would begin to bleed out through his mucous membranes. The virus would attack his internal organs. He would get a general toxemia. Some of the post-mortem examinations of the soldiers would show considerable tissue deterioration and severe internal hemorrhaging. They would have chronic diarrhea. Of course, they would get the pock marks on their skin. It was just a horrible disease. In addition to the fevers, their tongues and their teeth would turn black. They would dehydrate. They would have a prolonged infection. It would be 2 weeks or more of hellish suffering. And even if they did survive it, they would be left with pock marks, permanent hair loss, recurring eczema, deformities in the limbs, resulting in muscle and tissue damage. For men, it often meant sterility. The virus would infect the eyes. And then there were the psychological effects.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net.
Extra, read all about it.
If smallpox and other epidemics were making their way in waves through the Union and the Confederate armies, there were other epidemics and pandemics that were making their way around the world. For example, typhus. There were outbreaks of typhus in Baltimore and Memphis and Washington, D.C. They occurred during the War Between the States. They occurred in 1865. They occurred in 1873. It was believed that typhus was brought into the United States by Irish immigrants during that great famine that caused so many of them to emigrate to America during that time. And so it was often called the Irish fever, and it was known to be just virulent. It was caused by a bacteria that came mainly from lice. Also, the fleas on the rats and things would cause the bacteria to spread, and it would spread from humans to rodents and rodents to humans and so forth. Ticks would carry it. It was horrible. Of course, the Russians were also suffering from it. The French were suffering from it. But the worst cases of it were happening in Ireland. Of course, during the famine, the Irish, their immune systems were compromised due to hunger and starvation. And then they would come to the United States and they would bring it with them. In addition to typhus, there was also a yellow fever outbreak, and it was mainly carried by mosquitoes, and it had ravaged New Orleans shortly before the war between the states began. And also, there would be a big outbreak in Memphis shortly after the war as well. And the yellow fever was very common. In other words, it was one of the fevers that the soldiers would succumb to, especially in the South, especially those fighting in the swamps in New Orleans, in the swamps of Florida, in the swamps of Georgia, in the swamps of South Carolina. The yellow fever was something to be concerned about. There was an epidemic of the plague going on, and they called it the third plague pandemic, and it was going on mainly in Asia, particularly in China. And so that was going on concurrent with the war between the states as well. Smallpox, we talked about it, wreaking havoc in both armies. It wasn't just in the United States where smallpox was a problem. Europe was having a smallpox pandemic at the time as well. Also, Spanish colonies around the world were experiencing it. And so the disease is estimated to have killed some 400,000 Europeans annually during the 19th century. And that was going on, of course, concurrent with the war between the states as well. Cholera was a horrible, horrible disease that was spreading exponentially during the 19th century. It's an infection of the small intestine, and it's transmitted primarily by drinking water or eating food that's been contaminated by feces of an infected person. Again, we talked about how they didn't quite have the common sense back then to keep their latrines flowing downstream from where they were drawing their drinking water. And so cholera was quite an issue during the 19th century. In fact, there were 7 cholera waves of the cholera pandemic, and the last 2 waves occurred in the 20th century. But the first 5 waves of cholera occurred during the 19th century. And the first one started in 1816 and went to 1820, and it spread across India, into Southeast Asia, into Central Europe. It would ultimately last until 1826. Then in 1829, the second wave began, and it reached Russia, Hungary, Germany, Egypt in 1831. Then it went to London, Paris, Quebec, Ontario, and even New York City. By 1834, the cholera wave had reached the Pacific coast of North America, having gotten there by steamboat, river traffic, and so forth. Then in 1846, there was a third wave of the cholera pandemic, and it lasted until 1860. So it went right through the war between the states, and it was wreaking havoc. It was causing destruction and illness and even death, both north and south. In fact, Russia was the hardest hit with over 1 million deaths. Mecca in Saudi Arabia was hit, killing over 15,000 people. There was a 2-year outbreak in England and Wales, claimed 52,000 lives. In Paris, 14,000 people. Liverpool, England alone saw 5,308 deaths. And of course, this was a big point of embarkation for immigrants going to North America. And so New York City was taking in all of these cholera people, and cholera was able to claim thousands and thousands of lives in New York City as a result. 200,000 people in Mexico contracted cholera at this time. California and Oregon trails were getting hit with the cholera wave. The Mormons, of course, as all of those settlers were moving westward and they were going through Mormon territory, they were bringing the disease with them, and the Mormons were hit particularly hard as well. Cuba saw 6,000 people die at this time as well. The pandemic continued to spread. It spread to China, spread to Japan, spread to Korea, Iran, Iraq, Arabia, Russia, Tokyo, Brazil. Anywhere ships were sailing, cholera was going with them. There was a fourth cholera pandemic. It went from 1863 to 1875, also overlapping the war between the states. It spread more in Europe and Africa. At least 30,000 of the 90,000 pilgrims to Mecca died from the disease at that time. Cholera just ravaged northern Africa. In Zanzibar, it killed 70,000 people. 90,000 people died in Russia in 1866 alone. The Austro-Prussian War was a big spreader of the disease. In 1867, shortly after the war between the states, 113,000 people died in Italy. Another 80,000 died in Algeria. And there were also outbreaks in North America. 1866 to 1873, right after the war between the states, 50,000 Americans died from this fourth cholera pandemic wave. London, Wales, Amsterdam, New Orleans all saw lots of deaths as a result. Then in 1881 to 1896 was the fifth cholera pandemic, and it cost 250,000 lives in Europe and at least 50,000 in the Americas, 267,000 in Russia, 120,000 in Spain, 90,000 in Japan, 60,000 in Persia, 58,000 in Egypt, even 8,600 in Hamburg, Germany. And so all of these were occurring simultaneous to the disease outbreaks in the armies of the North and the South. And so the war between the states era was no stranger to epidemic and pandemic.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
Not only were soldiers during the war between the states and also the civilian populations of both the North and the South no stranger to disease and pandemic during the middle of the 19th century, they also were no strangers to opioid addiction. Of course, we have a big opioid crisis, as our government calls it today, because people are using the wrong things to try to manage their pain and disease. Well, guess what? In the 19th century, things were no different. The 19th century ushered in, basically, widespread opium use. And that actually happened shortly before the war between the states, mainly because you had a lot of Asian immigrants, mainly from China. They were coming into the western United States, and they brought the opium with them. And then these opiums, they became used in what were called patent medicines. Maybe you remember watching the old Western shows, and the medicine man would roll into town, and he would open up his wagon, and he would have these little brown bottles, and it would cure anything that ailed you. And they called these patent medicines. And these medicines usually were not patented. They were not regulated in any way. Who knew what they were made up of or in what amounts? But usually they were made up of things like alcohol and laudanum and morphine and other opioid-type ingredients. And again, they were supposed to cure what ailed you. a lot of mothers would buy these and give them to their babies because they were supposed to cure the colic. And instead, they ended up doping up their kids and in some cases, even killing their infants as they would overdose on things like opium or morphine. But these patent medicines were big businesses. And mothers would buy them because mothers back in the War Between the States era were the primary health care providers for their families. And these mothers were deathly afraid of their children getting diseases like cholera or typhoid or typhus because they weren't just ravaging the military population at the time, they were ravaging the civilian populations as well. And so they would buy these patent medicines. The medicine man would come into town, they would stock up, thinking that they were protecting their families from these horrible diseases, when in reality, they were just getting them addicted to harmful drugs. This is a pivotal point in history. The War Between the States era, from 1861 to 1865. Traditionally, many historians now are attributing that as the highest rate of opioid abuse in the 19th century. And the opium was dispensed in large amounts during the war. The Union physicians were distributing nearly 10 million opium pills and close to 3 million ounces of opium powders and tinctures to give it to the soldiers to help them to deal with pain, to treat any of a number of ailments. And the instant benefit to the soldiers who were in pain, of course, far outweighed any long-term consequences that might have come from the overuse. So, well-meaning wartime physicians who at that time had an average of 2 years of medical training, eagerly provided relief to the suffering, not realizing that they were addicting people to these horrible drugs. And of course, doctors even today, I think a lot of them are well-meaning. They see patients who are in pain, they want to help them. They want to give them something to be able to manage that, to have some relief. But of course, the side effects and the long-term consequences of what they're doing are possibly outweighing the benefit. And so again, these drugs today are being given out freely. Back in the War Between the States day, the Army doctors were just treating the symptoms, of course. They weren't treating the problems. Same thing happening today. Soldiers back then took the opioids for everything, whereas now we pretty much give them to people for chronic pain. Back then they took them for everything. Diarrhea, it was just used very liberally. And of course, after the war, you had a lot of people who were addicted to morphine. You had a lot of people who were addicted to opium. The reason for that was because of the way these things were used as medicines and pain managers during the war. One of the popular statistics states that 400,000 soldiers were addicts after the war. The hypodermic needle, it came to America in 1856, and so it was almost never used during the war. I mean, doctors would have people lick opium off their hands, and they would just give it to them in a bottle to drink or so forth. And so it wasn't like they could give them a small dose of something and give it to them, and inject it straight into their bloodstream. They had to give them large quantities of this so that they could get the desired effect. And of course, that also had another horrible effect there. But the fact is that the hospitals were rife with opium use, and more experts are starting to believe that opium use began at the War Between the States. In fact, one of the most well-known opium addicts was Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady of the United States, and she was addicted to morphine. From 1860 to 1880, opium abuse was a national crisis, and physical dependency from continuous use, a period that lasted more than 10 to 14 days, it became an issue. And so by 1892, the Journal of the American Medical Association was already calling on a ban of imports of opium because, there were still all of these people who were trying to feed their addictions that had begun during the War Between the States. Opioid addiction, we talk a lot about today. It dates back to the War Between the States, just as the soldiers, dealt with pandemics and epidemics, just like we're dealing with today. Anyways, just trying to put our history into a little bit of perspective as it relates to the War Between the States and the lives of our Confederate ancestors. I hope you've enjoyed today's show of TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Show. I hope that you'll tune in again next week. Until then, go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. Sign up to get a free copy of my newsletter if you're not already receiving it. And when you do, I will send you absolutely free of charge a copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents, until next week, God bless.